Okay, so this is the second part of the lecture, which really looked at the effect of the sales force on our prescribing. The lecture is called The Land of Uncertainty, Is the Salesperson King? And this second part follows on from the first, in which I really discuss the role of the sales and the sales companies in promoting certain types of treatment to us with various benefits that they felt were available from their new appliances. I really left the last lecture saying that when we are uncertain and we believe the sales force, at what point do we then start becoming salespeople ourselves? And we need to consider this quite carefully. These are some screenshots from sort of Damon operators' websites, and you can see that they're making the claims that the company make. However, this time around, the claims are not being made by the key opinion leaders or the advertising from the company. They're being made by people who are using the systems. What in fact they're doing is promoting the system on their website, but the information nevertheless is still incorrect. And it was quite interesting. In the UK, we have an organisation called the Advertising Standards Authority. And they were asked to look at the evidence that was being promoted on dentists' websites. And they came to this conclusion that the evidence provided by Ormco wasn't adequate to demonstrate that the appliances were any better or worse than others, and that the claims were misleading. Now, if the Advertising Standards Authority makes that claim, it really means that you're not allowed to continue in that form of advertising. And this led to a reduction in the claims that were made both by Ormco but on many orthodontist websites. So looking now at other methods in speeding up teeth, as I've said before, there are several methods. These are brackets and wires, various potions and pills, localised trauma, vibration and light. And let's look at a few of those and look at some of the evidence behind them. So first of all, let's talk about microosteoperforation. This was one of the first methods of speeding up tooth movement that I came across from a paper in the American Journal of Orthodontics by the team that developed this technique. In effect, microosteoperforation, or MOPS, is a method of causing small localised trauma to the alveolar bone. The theory being that the localised trauma then activates cytokines, which increases the rate of tooth movement. This has been shown to be true in animal studies, but at the moment they haven't really translated through to human studies. Like many methods of medicine and dentistry, animal studies seem to be favourable, but once it gets into the real world of clinical practice in humans, the effects drop off. This is the MOPS tool. It in effect is a small punch that is used to make small holes in the alveolar bone adjacent to the teeth through the cortex. The evidence behind MOPS when it first started was there were some animal studies, there was a Cochrane systematic review that's now been produced, and then there was one small trial in the American Journal of Orthodontics. So let's look at the Cochrane review first. This was by Porrick, Fleming and team, who looked at surgical procedures for accelerating orthodontic treatment. They found that there were 4 trials that reported on the rate of tooth movement, and that the increase in the rate of tooth movement was 2.3 millimetres over 3 months. And when you look at those confidence intervals, you can see that that can range from 1.5 to 2.5 if the studies are repeated. So there is a very small movement there, and we have to always remember the effect sizes. So 2 millimetres over 3 months isn't much to write home about, but they felt also that this evidence was of low quality. So let's look back at the original paper that was published in the AJO. The lead author was Mani Alicani, who was a great promoter of methods of increasing the rate of tooth movement. So what this was, it was a small trial of 20 adults. It was a split mouth study which immediately causes some problems because of potential crossover effects. Participants were randomised to either receive MOPS and treatment as usual on either side of the mouth, and they measured canine tooth movement. Their overall conclusion was that using microosteoperforation gave them a gain of about 0.5 millimetres a month again, a very small effect size. So what did I think about this study? Well, first of all, I think it's best to think of this as being a pilot or a phase 2 study. It was very small and very experimental, and there certainly were errors in the measurement that they used. For example, they did not measure tooth movement against stable points. They measured tooth movement against other teeth, which of course could be moving. It is useful though, and it's useful for other studies in terms of providing data that can be used for power calculations. The other issue though, which is very helpful, is that it just provides us information on canine retraction. It doesn't provide any information on total treatment time, and that of course is crucial. I don't really want to know if our canines retract faster. I want to see what is the effect of this intervention on our total treatment time. So let's have another study. This was published later in the AJO, and they looked at three-dimensional assessment of the effects of MOPS on adults with class 2 malocclusion. Their measurement technique was a little more sophisticated. They measured the teeth in 3 dimensions. The MOPS were placed between the canine and the first premolar, the second premolar, because the first premolar had been extracted. What did they show here? Well, what they showed here was quite interesting in that, again, I want you to look at the effect sizes, and you can see that the effect sizes here between the interventions, this is control and MOPS, were very small, in the region of 0.2, 0.8 and 0.05. So that suggests to me, and the authors agreed, that the differences that were detected here were not clinically significant. So again, the evidence towards surgical, or that supports surgical adjuncts to orthodontic treatment, really suggests that there might be an effect. The studies are relatively flawed with very small samples, but importantly, when that effect is detected, the effect size is rather small. And we have to then consider, is it worth the additional cost, burden of care and trauma of having localised trauma to your alveolus worth very small effects? And I would say it doesn't. So now let's talk about Excelodent, which is a famous story. I'm not going to linger too long on this because I have blogged about this extensively. But Excelodent was a great example of how claims could be made with very little evidence, widespread adoption of a technique, and a lot of money made by some people. And eventually, when the research was published, it was shown that Excelodent did not really have an effect on the rate of tooth movement. The theory behind Excelodent was that it would provide a vibratory force which would stimulate bone movement. And they felt that just 20 minutes of using the Excelodent vibratory advice would increase the rate of tooth movement. There are several papers on this, and really I'm just going to look at 2. So the first was a paper in the Journal of Dental Research, which is a very high impact journal, very difficult to get into. And the second was on cyclic loading and vibration. This was from a team out of Texas, the lead author, Dr. Pavlin. This was published in Seminars in Orthodontics, and I'm not really sure if this paper was well refereed. I was certainly very familiar with attempts to get this paper published in the American Journal of Orthodontics, where of course it was rejected because of its significant flaws. So let's look at these 2 papers. So first of all, the Woodhouse study was published in the Journal of Dental Research. It was a well carried out trial that was carried in several practices providing orthodontics in the UK. It was independent, there were no conflicts of interests, and importantly, they found no difference in the rate of tooth movement. They found an absence of evidence that Excelodent worked. And you can see this in these Kaplan-Meier curves, where they're all the same. This is the sort of the survival time, or the time that it takes to achieve alignment, and you can see that there were no differences between the groups. They then continued this work, the same team did, and they looked at space closure, treatment duration and occlusal outcome. This is much more relevant because we're now looking at the final effects of treatment, not on simple phases of orthodontic treatment. And this is what they found. In effect, in terms of space closure per month, This was Accellident at 0.8 millimetres, this was Accellident's sham at 0.68, and this was fixed appliances only at 0.95. There was no real differences there in space closure. When you looked at the overall duration of treatment, they actually showed that the treatment with Accellident appeared to take longer than with the sham and the fixed appliances only. However, these differences weren't statistically significant, so they don't exist. And of course, there was no difference in the final occlusal result. So looking now at the Dubravko-Pavlin paper, this was a study that was published in Seminars in Orthodontics in a special edition that was involved with the reporting on methods of measuring the rate of tooth movement. In effect, this study, there was an accurate measurement technique by measuring against TADs which could move. There was mixed mechanics between all the patients. There wasn't a consistent approach, so any effect of on tooth movement or rate of tooth movement could have occurred because of the mechanics. There was an appropriate statistical analysis in that it was very simplistic. It was a very small sample, and importantly, the lead author was a paid consultant, and this was an industry-funded study. So there are significant conflicting interests here. This was the method of measuring tooth movement, where they measured the distance from this point C to T to a temporary anchorage device that was here. This is fraught with error because they were measuring a diagonal line, but also, more importantly, there's nothing to say that the temporary anchorage device was not going to move. What did they find? They found that with Accellident, the mean rate of tooth movement was 1.16, and for the control it was 0.79. They made a lot about this being very different, and they got very excited about this. However, their effect size was 0.37. Again, is it worth the extra effort and cost to get 0.37 millimetres? I would say not. So their advertising was interesting because they actually then translated this across to say that this was up to 50% faster. But 50% of not very much is not very much. So the effect size is small, even though it was 50% faster. It's also interesting to see that comment there to say it was up to 50% faster. That means it could be 1% faster, and they wouldn't be lying. And this is a tactic that's often used by companies, is to measure up to a certain amount, and that 50% is the thing that catches your attention. For example, this is Virgin Broadband. It's an old slide now in the area that I live, but they say Vivid Fibre Broadband is very fast. It's more than 2 times faster than BT and faster than Sky. However, that's not necessarily the truth, because I get 2 megabytes at night. 2, of course, is much less than the 50% that they're claiming. So when you look at Accellident, there's no evidence that it's effective, and there's maximum uncertainty around the one study that actually promotes its use. Other studies have shown that there's an absence of evidence for its effect. I came across this great quote by an orthodontist called Cliff Capus in the United States, who actually summarised Accellident quite nicely by saying that it was the air guitar of orthodontics. And I think that's a good way to think, a rather complex thing that we pretend makes teeth move faster. But that hasn't deterred the advertisers. This is an advertisement from an orthodontist in London, UK, and claiming that Accellident increases the rate of orthodontic tooth movement. And of course we now know that it doesn't. This was then picked up by the Advertising Standards Authority, and again in the UK they concluded Accellident has not provided adequate evidence to support their claim, and they conclude that this has been not substantiated and it was misleading, which again means that you're not allowed to make these claims in the UK. So we have to think, have we become the snake oil sellers in that sort of drive to perhaps promote something that's new and potentially useful to our patients? Or are we doing this because we haven't really evaluated the evidence that underpins these claims? Or are we just simply out to make more money from suggesting methods of treatment that patients have to pay more, but in fact do not have an effect. And I think that's the important thing, is that it goes back to something that I said in other lectures, is that scientific research doesn't really tell people what they like to hear. It tends to come up with things that are more couched in uncertainty and draw attention to things such as effect size. Whereas those who are promoting the treatment tell people what they would like to hear. And these, of course, are things such as it moves your teeth faster, it reduces the amount of pain. People like to hear this, orthodontists like to hear this, and they also like to tell people and their patients that treatment will be better. So this was our overall problem that we have in the land of no evidence, is the salesman king. And we must be very careful that we don't over-promote some of the goods that we provide. We need to look at the research evidence, not get so caught up in the sales promotion, but most importantly, not becoming salespeople ourselves. Thank you very much.